Hey there, internet friends. Welcome to another episode of That Nerdy Site Show, a weekly podcast where the team members from That Nerdy Site get together to talk about our lives and all of the nerdy things we love about them. I'm your host, Trevor Starkey, and joining me this week, we have Frank Bizzani. How you doing, Frank?
I'm doing great, and I'm happy to dive in and talk about some games we've been playing and everything else we've been up to.
Indeed, yeah. We were talking a little bit before we started recording, or after we started recording, but before we started recording the episode, and you seem to be doing it in a good place. And it's been a few weeks since we've had you on this show to talk about some of these things. One of the things I think we can talk about here, kind of in this introductory section that we won't necessarily do a full dedicated section for. You mentioned you sat down and watched Shang-Chi. Obviously, Cameron and I did a deeper kind of spoiler cast impressions of the film on last week's episode, I think. So diving into the non-spoiler free stuff, what were your thoughts on Shang-Chi?
I definitely loved it. I listened to that podcast that Cam and you did, and I think you guys hit the nail on the head on a lot of how I feel too. But I really did just like absolutely love Shang-Chi, and especially like I am a huge Marvel fan and an MCU fan, but lately, even especially after Endgame, like I'm getting the burnout, on like a lot of the properties, but now like Shang-Chi totally just like reinvigorated me for like, oh wow, we can do new interesting things. And like it's not really a spoiler, but they basically just made a full martial arts movie, and it's just in the MCU. And like I know even Cam kind of highlighted some of that with like his history of like love of like martial arts and like kung fu movies, and like I like some of those too, even though I'm not the most well versed. But I think like not only it's cool to see that, it's like it's a good one. They did it really well. With the action's amazing and it's really well choreographed. I thought all the actors were great. I really loved everybody, the whole cast, and I'm excited to see like more of a lot of those characters in other like MCU going forward.
Yeah.
And I'm also excited for it's not slated yet, but I'm assuming there will be a second one, and I'm very excited for that, and if they can actually like make that happen.
Oh, definitely. Yeah. You mentioned that it like there isn't a Shang-Chi 2 kind of on the books, but it very much feels like I hope they do like obviously Black Panther blew up, and we're like, let's do a Black Panther 2. And obviously that's going to be a very different beast when it eventually comes out. But yeah, I very much kind of walk away from this also excited to see wherever those characters continue to pop up in the MCU, but the idea of a Shang-Chi 2 absolutely like just centered on that cast of characters and that focus. And I love that, like the lightest of spoilers, but we do get like a tease at the end of the film of the 10 rings will return. And so I'm like excited for whatever iteration that ends up being, and whether that's Shang-Chi, whether that's his sister character, or whatever form that the Ten Rings return to, I think we'll get a cool story out of that, and cool action and cool set pieces and all those elements. It was just I'm glad you had a great time with it, because it was very much a very like I have not felt that same burnout that you and Cameron have kind of discussed on the series of like Marvel stuff. I'm still just enjoying all of they want to feed me, because I think it's such a nice high quality that I'm completely content for it to keep coming in. But the idea that like this film, as opposed to especially the last three, like taking Black Widow out of the equation, the last three Marvel things we've gotten have been weekly episodic TV shows, 4 if you count What If even right now. But it has been like here's a little bit of, a larger story doled out over multiple weeks. That this being a fully standalone kind of film is a breath of fresh air in the Marvel universe that I was excited for, and I think really paid off, and it left me even more excited for Eternals coming up, because much like Shang-Chi, like I know nothing about the Eternals, so I am just excited for the visual spectacle that I imagine I am in for based on what we've seen in the trailers and stuff on that. So very cool.
Yeah.
I'm glad you enjoyed it.
Yeah, no, and I totally agree with you on Eternals there too, because I hadn't seen the most recent Eternals trailer till I was in the theater for Shang-Chi, and that was actually got me more interested in Eternals, because I was like, oh, I feel like I actually have an idea of like what this movie's about, and like who these people are, because I know that's another one of those like I know of them, but I know literally nothing about those characters or like what they do. And So I'm excited to like get some new stuff. And that's what I like about this phase of the MCU we're going into, is we're getting into even the obscure things that like I don't really know.
Yeah.
And but then that trailer finally kind of sold me, where like I'm like, okay, it actually, like, I get the idea now, and I'm a little bit more interested to see it. And then of course the No Way Home trailer is like one of the hypest trailers I've ever seen in my life, and like I'm like, this movie's gonna be incredible.
Mhm.
Like,
Yeah, the I remember the first Eternals trailer came out and I was like, okay, cool. This definitely looks like it's going to be a visual feast, but I have zero idea of like what the story of this movie is going to be about. And then yeah, this most recent Eternals trailer is very much like, hey, all this stuff happened after the snap, led to the emergence, and we have 7 days to stop it. And and so they do a much better job of like introducing like, hey, here are kind of the stakes of what this movie is going to be about, and even the timeline of like, we've seen stuff from the past, but like this is a movie that exists in a post Endgame kind of universe, and it is kind of a forward momentum kind of continuation of the story. So I'm very much excited about that. And yeah, it is just like the same unknown factor of like going into Shang-Chi and being like, I mean, I've done like the very base level like introduction of some of these characters from like watching various like, hey, here's what you need to know about Shang-Chi before you go into the movie, and here's, you know, this character's kind of background in the series, and very much still being like, I don't know anything to expect, and so just being like endlessly pleasantly surprised by that. Like I talked about obviously last week, the idea that like going into a Shang-Chi movie, I was expecting and based on like the early kind of reviews and stuff, I was expecting Simu Liu as Shang-Chi to be very good, and Aquafina to be a fun kind of like counterpart sidekick kind of character. I was not expecting how rich and fun the expanded cast was going to be. In particular,
yeah.
like his sister, the actress playing his sister Xialing, and like Michelle Yeoh's character and some of the other kind of family members and extended kind of characters in that universe. I was just like, yes, please give me more of all of these characters. Like I loved everything we got from them. So I'm glad you had a similar experience. So moving on from that, today's episode proper is going to be much more focused on some of the games we've been playing. Frank has sat down with Psychonauts 2 as well as The Artful Escape. I also sat down with The Artful Escape as well as Life is Strange True Colors. So we'll be talking a lot about those three games, and then I might have also some kind of base level thoughts on the musical that is now on Apple Plus TV called Come From Away. So stay tuned for more of each of those things, and look in the description for any of the timestamps on those that you're looking for. But before we dive into that, a little bit of housekeeping for you. If you liked what you hear, please remember to like, subscribe, rate, review, and share the podcast with your friends everywhere you can. And if you're feeling extra generous, you can always support us on Patreon at patreon.com/thatnerdysite, just like our wonderful Patreon producers do. So I think we'll go a little bit chronologically, and Psychonauts 2 came out a few weeks ago, so I it is the one I have experienced the least. So I want to hear your thoughts, Frank, on Psychonauts 2. This is a game we've talked about very basically when I sat down a few weeks back or a month back or whatever, and sat down and did like a let's play for the channel on the original Psychonauts, as somebody who never played that original game kind of in the lead up to it. I sat down with it and I was like, okay, I appreciate this as like a platform experience, but I'm not overly eager to sit down and like experience out the rest of the story for it, just because I think I probably missed the boat on that, and there's just enough other stuff that I'm interested in doing versus like hopping into this 15-year-old game or whatever. But Psychonauts 2, from everything I've been hearing, is coming out and is largely like, hey, even if you're not a Psychonauts fan, this is a game you want to check out. It's a game I have downloaded on my Xbox Series X. I just haven't had the time to sit down and spend time with it. But you have, as a fan of of the original Psychonauts game. So tell me your thoughts now that you've completed Psychonauts 2, Frank.
Yeah, I definitely, just quick overview thoughts. Like, I definitely just loved the game as a whole. I think it can take a little bit to get going in the beginning, and especially because like the first Psychonauts has a little bit of a similar problem, especially where like your actual like since you don't have a ton of your abilities and they're super not upgraded, the actual platforming is kind of slower and tougher, let alone the combat's similar. And then with this one of the things I had a little bit of a problem with too is like you get through the intro level and then it kind of dumps you in the hub world, but the hub world is like 3 times bigger than the camp was, and there's so many things you can do and talk to. So I spent like 2 hours in the hub world before I went to like the next world I was supposed to go to.
Mm-hmm.
Which is like one of those things of like, well, yeah, you could just kind of fire through the story, or you can do all of this other great stuff, and then get a lot of like talk to people and do collect things, and you just get a lot of great bits there. But so that's why I think sometimes the pacing can be a little bit weird, especially if you are just like me, like you're a Psychonauts fan, so you're stopping and smelling the roses every 2 feet and like talking to people and reading the posters and stuff. But to what you had said there before, I think I definitely agree with you where like it does such a great job of not only onboarding people who have never played a Psychonauts before, like as soon as you fire up the game, it just walks you through like an overview of the story for Psychonauts 1 and Rhombus of Ruin. And it kind of skips through Rhombus of Ruin really quickly because but like it totally gives you the whole setup, and it's not even like it's just showing you the original game. They did like cartoon drawings of like Raz is describing it to you, and it's kind of like if he drew in his notebook like this is what I did last summer, like, you know.
Nice.
And like so I thought that did a great job of like getting you familiar and onboarded in if you didn't know. And then the actual game itself, I still think if you had never even touched the other games, I still think you can come in and get a great experience here, because the highlight of the game is the story it's able to tell by going through these levels of like people's brains and kind of going through their cognitions. And that's where you get all these amazing rich stories, and it has like very little to do with like previous Psychonauts lore, but all of that's there if you get it, if that makes sense. It's like people offhandedly mention things, and there's references to things and jokes that are just there that you may miss. But I think as a whole, the main story is completely understandable. Like if you had no idea what had ever happened in the previous Psychonauts, but if you did, you're just getting all those little extra bits of like jokes and humor and stuff like that.
A lot of little Easter eggs for you of like if you're in the know, here's like we're gonna kind of tell through this, and like one line of this bit of dialogue is like extra for you, where like, hey, here's a fun reference to a character from the last game, or a nod, or a joke or something like that we're kind of like looping back in. But if you don't know that, you're not really missing out on anything.
Exactly. And because like a good example I think is like Coach Oleander in the first game ended up, spoilers for Psychonauts 1 slightly, he ends up being one of the bad guys, but it's because of stuff that's going on in his mind, and you're able to get him back, and he goes back to being normal. So he's still a Psychonaut, and he's in this game, but there's a part where he's like freaking out about something, and he's like, we can't let this happen, and blah 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 blah, and somebody's like, weren't you just putting people's brains in machines at the campground and like creating all these crazy war robots and stuff? And he's like, well,
Mm-hmm.
and that is Psychonauts 1, but you didn't, you can even like get the same kind of joke there, if not. But that's the kind of things that I definitely enjoyed. And there was some stuff for Rhombus of Ruin where I was like, okay, I don't have a PSVR, so I never experienced it, and I wanted to go try to watch like a playthrough, and I just never got to it before firing it up. But there's even Rhombus of Ruin things where I was like, okay, I guess that's a Rhombus of Ruin thing, because I was like, I didn't really get that one, but
yeah.
I was like, it's kind of like Captain America or the reverse, where I'm like, I didn't get that one, but I get it's a reference. Like you're referencing something.
Mm-hmm. I understood that's a reference. I didn't understand that reference, but I understood it's a reference. Got it. Yeah.
Exactly. But other than that, like, as like I think the game, like I think the main story is actually really strong. And I think that not only is the actual narrative just pretty good in general, I think like I said, the way they're able to tell it through actually going through people's cognitions, and like not only are you like, it's that interesting thing that Persona does where you get to see how people perceive the world and how they think of things, and different people think of things different ways, and like you'll get to see the same event but from like different perspectives. And that was the thing I really enjoyed, is like you get the hero's perspective, and then you get the bad guy's perspective, and then he feels like he's been slighted by the heroes, and it's like there's this whole like really deep narrative there that you're also like piecing together by like, it doesn't always just sit there and tell you everything. Like you're going through the cognition, and you're looking at just the world and how the NPCs react, and how everybody has like their own version of themselves in their cognition, and then those are like the brutally honest versions of themselves. Like one of the levels, I don't want to get deep into a ton of the story stuff because I think it is so great to experience, but like one of the guys, you go into his cognition, he's like battling alcoholism because of something that happened in his past. So it's like there's a lot of platforming that going through bottles. And when you go into the bottle, there's a cool thing where you go into the bottle and then it's kind of going into his memories of like why the things he's like hiding from and why he feels like he, is like basically turned to alcohol.
Mm-hmm.
But then your whole point there is to like work with this character and help them work past these things and basically kind of become themselves again, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
And that's
definitely.
like, sorry, go ahead.
I was just, yeah, definitely. It definitely sounds like, I mean, like I've heard the comparison to Persona 5 a couple times of like this weird, like it is, I mean, you're diving into like these people's psyche and you're trying to kind of like help, like almost therapeutically help them through this issue that they're encountering. So I love the idea of like in this particular example, like somebody who has kind of like, relied on a crutch of alcoholism to exposing them to that and identifying that and saying here's a way out of that, as kind of like a mental health solution, I guess.
Yeah, no, and that's exactly right. And it got to a point for a while where I almost thought like there might not be an end boss, like a boss fight. I thought we might just resolve it through like talking. And I think that could have even been a cool way to go. You still get a little bit of an actual like boss fight you have to fight, but the whole game, definitely the themes are about like over like you have people, everybody has these things they're struggling with and these demons in their past, and it's really about like accepting those and being open and honest about them. And then even talk once Raz kind of goes through the level and comes back, they're now like fixed in the real world because their brain is somewhat like repaired. So then they're actually like people act differently and people talk differently. And it's that some of that thing of like, oh, I feel like my old self again, and that like a lot of those themes definitely connect home for me. And that's why I think it actually, they end up telling a really strong narrative that even though it's in this wrapping of a cartoon world that's constantly like Gatling gunning jokes at you, if you really sit there and think about it, like there's a really deep narrative there. And honestly, I think a lot of people are going to be able to dive deep and write like essays and do YouTube videos about like all of the things it tackles and all of the themes. And I like that they also take that a step further where a lot of those themes come into the gameplay where now the enemies you fight are all themed after other like mental health issues.
Mm-hmm.
So there's an enemy that's a bad mood. There's an enemy that's like doubt. There's judgment. There's panic attacks. Like and these are just enemies that'll show up in the world. And they not only are they all fun and creative because each one has like a different power that is meant to kind of combat that specifically. And you have like 9 different psychic powers and you can use all of them any way you want. And like your Psy Blast where you just fire a laser does damage to everybody, but some people are super fast and they'll dodge out of the way, or some people like will do other moves. And so it's cool that but you'll get a power where like I can stop time. So if I hit the enemy with that, they'll slow down and then I can just blast them. And they're constantly just like the gameplay is constantly evolving to the point where then you're fighting like all these different kind of mental health disorders in one stage and you're switching between all your different abilities. And that's one thing I wish was a little bit stronger, is that like you only get to have 4 abilities like active at any time that are used for the bumpers and the triggers.
Mm-hmm.
But then if you need another ability, you basically have to go into your backpack and like equip the other abilities to one of those buttons. And that's just one of those things that like grinds the game to a halt almost. And it only takes like 2 seconds to go into your backpack, equip it, and pop back out. So I got to be honest there. But when I'm in the middle of a fight, and like especially at the end when I was super powerful, the fighting felt great when I would like dodge out of the way and be blasting and using my telekinesis to pick things up and throw objects at people. And I would even use the pyro a lot where I had it upgraded so you just basically cast this giant fireball all around you. But then it sucks when an enemy shows up and I'm like, oh, I need to stop time. So then I have to stop, get rid of pyro. I need the time stop power. Okay, cool. Like, so that's one problem I had with it.
So it's one of those things like a weapon wheel as like the alternative might have been a better approach for a case like that of like the playing Doom or something like that, where you can just kind of push the trigger button and choose the weapon that you're looking for. Time's going to slow down a little bit while you're making that choice, not to a complete stop, but like it's a much more fluid kind of movement, I think it sounds like, than maybe Psychonauts has to offer.
Yeah, no, I think you're totally right there, and I think like I agree with that, and that's just like it's not a game breaking thing or like a deal breaker, but it's something I noticed, especially it's more prevalent when you get to the end of the game, and like I said, they're throwing all of these enemies at you at the same time, and you can just be shooting your side blast or doing whatever powers you prefer, but each enemy has a way that it's ideally combated.
Mm-hmm.
But that's actually kind of a cool one too, where like the bad mood, the way it doesn't, you can't beat it through combat. You basically have to use clairvoyance to see through its eyes, and you have to figure out what in the area is causing the bad mood, and then it turns into a good mood and goes away.
Yeah, okay. Very cool.
And so, but that's like all the cool stuff they're doing, and that's and they really like understand the themes, and they take it all the way from like top to bottom, from the combat through the story through everything, and that's like some of the stuff that I really enjoyed about the game.
As somebody who didn't play the original Psychonauts, how much of an evolution is that in terms of like the combat system and the gameplay from the original game?
It is only like a slight kind of modification. So it's the same kind of concepts as like you had multiple psi powers. You could only have so many equipped at a time. And so that is all pretty much identical. And then you definitely use the psi powers in combat way better this time, because not only do they feel better to actually use, the fact that the enemies require certain powers to sort of beat them is also kind of makes you switch and use different stuff. But the thing that I think they mainly improved on is not only does like the actual platforming and the actual powers feel better just in the way they control, it's you can upgrade them so they get stronger. And it's very much that like skill tree kind of thing where you get to pick the upgrades, or it's sort of like I want to upgrade telekinesis, so you get the next telekinesis upgrade. But in Psychonauts 1, the upgrades were like the game basically just gave you the upgrades.
Gotcha.
Like it would be like, okay, so like you hit this level, so now your power also does this, or it was a little bit more like that. So I think this system is a little bit better, where it's open for you to be able to kind of customize like what powers you wanted to upgrade, or what you really want, or what you need. And then they also added this mechanic where you can get pins, which are modifiers to your powers. A lot of the pins are really cool, and they'll do things like one of the powers was you can like grab an enemy, but then if you get a pin, it's like a vampire pin. So then when you grab them, you'll suck health from them and like heal. So a lot of them make your powers stronger, and some of them are just cosmetic. Like one of them will turn your levitation ball that you can use to run around on. You can turn it to like red, blue, or green, I think is the other one. And then I also found out that if you equip multiple, it changes the colors. So if you do red and blue, it becomes purple. But the thing is like you can only equip 3 pins at a time. Mm-hmm. So they made so many awesome pins I want to play with and use in my gameplay, and like you can't, because it's like not like you can swap between them on the fly, but it's another one of those things of going into my backpack to change pins is annoying. Like
yeah.
And one of the pins, for example, is a high level pin that you get towards the end of the game, is like a discount in the store, and it's 50% off everything, but you have to be wearing the pin to get the discount. And so the thing is like that takes up one of your slots, but that's one of the best pins in the game. But if I'm like, well, I want my lev ball to be purple, then it's like, all right, well, you can't do that. Like, because you only have so many slots, and using it on like the cosmetic and the fun ones, like there's one that you can use your telekinesis hand to pet animals in the world. That's a pin, but it's like that's a fun pin, but it's like there's all these other that actually help gameplay. Like
there's no real gameplay benefit to petting animals in the field. Yeah,
exactly. But other than the little cute animation of like rubbing a goat with this like ghost hand. But because the pin that I used for like the whole game was if for your telekinesis hand, you can pick up objects and enemies and just like things, and you can throw them at other things. But there's a pin that's if there's nothing around that you can pick up, you'll just rip up a part of the ground. So basically you can always be throwing your telekinesis stuff. And that to me was a hugely helpful pin that also makes the boss fights like a lot easier, because a lot of the boss fights have that classic thing of like the boss will toss whatever you need to throw at it like on the stage, or there's like 1 or 2 that are like that. But I didn't have to worry about it. I'm just chucking rocks like constantly. I'm just tearing up whatever, and then I'm using my Psy Blast, and like I was just eviscerating some of the bosses, and like, but that made me feel powerful in a way that like I never felt in Psychonauts 1.
Yeah. Something like that sounds a little bit like, did you play Control?
Yes, yeah, exactly. That's actually a
it's
really
very
good
much
comparison.
it's that like, hey, yeah, you have this ability that yes, you will pull like a garbage can from the environment, but if there's no garbage can in that environment, you're just going to rip up some of the asphalt from the ground and just launch that at people.
Yeah, yeah, no, that's a perfect comparison, and that's another thing I loved in Control. Like, I loved the power of the telekinesis. I loved upgrading it so it did crazy damage. Like, and then I loved having that where you would just tear up the ground, and like that was like my favorite ability was the telekinesis hand, and then being able to tear up the ground. And then when I upgraded my side blast, it's like I could fire like 5 blasts and be throwing rocks. Like I was putting out like crazy damage.
Hmm.
And then there's still a whole other tool belt of like abilities you could use, which so that's why I definitely think they've improved on like all of that. It's just the pins is another thing I have a problem with because I wish you could have all of them active or just unactive at the same time because I would have turned on like most of them.
Hmm.
But instead I was relegated to only having like 3 at a time. And it's that thing of like, okay, well, I'll take off the one for the store because I'm in a level and you can't use the store. But now if I go to the store, I have to stop and like swap my pins. Like it's just like it's just annoying.
Yeah, I can appreciate that. It's one of those like, oh, it's they're almost somewhat acting like cheats that you would see in other games. Like I think of immediately like Ratchet and Clank, the most recent Ratchet and Clank. Like the golden nuts that you can get in that are just like, hey, these are things you can toggle on or off, and they're gonna affect like your gameplay or whatever. Versus like these pins, it sounds like are more like, hey, these aren't just toggle on and off; they are things you have to equip, and they are going to be locked in, and some of them aren't going to be useful at certain times. Like yeah, like a pin that affects your store and is kind of like giving you a perk in the storefront doesn't do anything for you while you're out in the main missions of the game or something like that. So yeah, I can appreciate that. Last little question I have, I think, here is one of the things I've heard about the game a lot is that the gameplay itself kind of switches up a little bit with each level because like like each mine you're going into is like a drastic change. Like I've heard well, like one of the early ones I think is like a dentist or something like that, so the
Yeah.
whole level is like dentist themed and teeth and stuff like that, and then you move on to other levels that are going to have completely other themes and completely other environments. Is the gameplay itself shifting a lot between those different versions, or is it more just like you're in a new environment so it has new themes and new ideas that you're having to approach, but the the platforming is still going to be the same, the combat's still going to be largely the same?
I would say it's largely the latter there, where the actual gameplay itself, especially from the platforming and the combat, is just like the same across. But they do because of the way the levels are so different and designed, there is a little bit of different there is different gameplay and kind of like how you're traversing. Like some of them, like one of the level that has to deal with alcoholism is actually a little bit more open, and at one point you can actually like it you're he's sort of trapped on an island and you can get on a boat and then go explore the other islands, and the other islands are like the things he's hiding from. But that's the thing is like that's a really open level that you can just go around on by boat, but that's really unique to that level.
Mm-hmm.
There's other levels where like there's just they'll do different kinds of things like with the platforming, and like there's one where somebody's mind is kind of really messed up. So instead of it just being like a normal platforming level, it's like I'm walking up this way and the platform looks normal to me because I'm walking on it. But then when I get to another platform, I can look over and I can see that is just like vertical, if that makes sense. Like all
like
of the platforms are super like,
yeah,
it's like an MC
MC Escher.
painting.
Exactly, that's the comparison I was going to draw. Yeah.
No, because that's kind of the same thing I had thought. Like it is kind of like that, and I'm like, that's kind of really cool. Like because this person is kind of like messed up. Um, but yeah, that's why like there is little bit of gameplay differences, but the actual like platforming combat is identical the whole way through.
Okay. It's yeah, the when I was hearing people talk about the game a little bit, I started getting vibes similar, like a little bit of It Takes Two, which I don't think you played earlier this year, but
Mm-mm.
like Logan and I played, and like the interesting thing about It Takes Two was like it in almost every level it introduces new like mechanics that you're going to use in that level and that level alone. It's basically like here's a new thing you're going to use that's going to change how you kind of interact with this level, and we've designed this level around these particular skills and abilities. And then like once you're done with this section, you're not going to be doing that anymore. Like the one of the levels that Logan and I really loved in particular was like oh, I had the ability to like, for certain objects, I could like reverse time or like move it forward in time. Like I had time manipulation, and like Logan had like the ability to like shrink and become tall or something like that. And it was like we had to use those particular skills to solve puzzles through that level or through that area. And then like once we got out of that area, it was like, okay, I don't have that ability anymore. Now I have an ability where I can shoot like water out of this plant on my head or something like that, and like grow flowers, and it was just like it was constantly like reinventing the game itself kind of along the way. And it sounds like Psychonauts does that from a visual aesthetic level to level as you're battling whatever demons that person is battling on that level. But the core gameplay elements and your powers and stuff are largely, it sounds like, the same. So okay, cool. Any final thoughts on Psychonauts 2 before we move on to one of our other topics?
Yeah, I guess one of the last things that I do have on it is that like they're able to introduce a lot of new characters in this one, so I think that's also partly why it doesn't necessarily have to rely on the old game. But it was kind of interesting that like all the other characters from the first game, like all those other camper kids, are just kind of gone and they're not referenced like whatsoever really. Like
Mm-hmm.
but then they introduce a whole new cast of kids that are like interns at the Psychonauts program, and I didn't hate any of those kids, but I definitely feel like they I didn't like get to know them as much or like enjoy them as much as like the campers, especially because of my the campers were really weird, and that's what was kind of funny about the first one.
Mm-hmm.
And these other Psychonauts interns are definitely like they're still kind of weird, especially because that's the world, but they definitely feel like a lot more normal, just like kids that would be kind of going to this program.
Okay.
And a lot of the stuff with them, I believe, is just scattered throughout the hub world. Like you get introduced to them in the story, they do show up in the main story, but like you can go talk to them and interact with them, and there's a side quest that one of them gives you. But I think I missed a lot of those interactions. Like I did some of them, but by the end of the game, like when one of them kind of showed up and then said something, and I was like, I don't even know what you're talking about. Like I guess I missed a conversation or something with them. Like, and it wasn't like a game breaking thing again, but it's like again he offhandedly mentions this line, and I'm like, okay, you're new, so you're not talking about another game. Like you're talking about something that I missed, I guess.
Yeah. Okay.
Um,
Yeah, it's definitely I remember from my brief stint in the original Psychonauts, like immediately those characters are all like a cross between like Rugrats and like Tim Burton kind of like design aesthetic and characteristics and stuff. And it's like, okay, these kids are all very, very weird. And I certainly remember the kid with like the giant fro, and then
yep.
the kid who like had crazy mind powers and the tinfoil hat or whatever, from just my very limited experience with those characters. So yeah, if they're kind of not carried forward into this new version, they're kind of replaced by a new batch. I imagine that there is like a weird like element of like, hey, yeah, you like your new people that I need to learn about, but I'm also getting all this other like new experience in there. So maybe I'm not getting as much time with them as I would expect, or it is like, oh, you need to do like all sorts of side quests to really like dig into what those other interns are kind of looking for.
Yeah, because that's definitely how I feel. Because like I said, I don't like dislike any of them really, or like hate them. And some of them are kind of fun, but it's like I feel like they're definitely there, and I feel like I just didn't get to spend a lot of time with them or kind of get that relationship. And I know some of it must be side stuff that like I just didn't find them in the hub world at one point and talk to them and have a conversation. But it's also that thing of like, that's not great.
Hmm.
Like this first Psychonauts had that a little bit where like there was stuff all over the camp that you could just miss, and like fun conversations and cutscenes, and this like triples down on that in terms of how much there is, and I liked that. But at some point it is this kind of tug and pull where like I want to go to the cool cognition worlds and do this like experience this amazing narrative that I'm kind of like hooked into, and then you just kind of have to stop and run around the hub world and like talk to people and do stuff like that. And that's when it kind of slows all the pacing down.
Hmm.
And then I stopped doing that a little bit. And then clearly I missed things that could have been cool or fun, or even maybe just helped like me get to know these other random characters.
Yeah, tying it back to Persona again, like you didn't like social link up with these characters along the story necessarily, and so when you get to the end game or something like that, you're hearing things from these characters for the first time. That's like, oh, if you had like built a relationship up with them throughout the game, you would have had a better understanding of it. Sounds like cool.
Yeah, I think that's a great comparison too.
Well, I'm glad you super enjoyed that game, and I remember seeing you like a few days ago. You kind of tweeted that out as like this is like your game of the year so far, and then seeing today that has already shifted to the next game we're going to talk about here, the Artful Escape, which is I think now currently like moved up to your list on game of the year stuff. This was notably my game of PAX last year at the last event we were able to all go to before the pandemic. I played the Artful Escape from Annapurna at PAX East last year, 2020, and was just blown away by like the style and the sound of that. So tell me now that you've gone hands on, you've finished the game, correct?
Yes, yeah, totally. I 100%ed it, got all the achievements.
There you go. Nice. I did not. I didn't do the stage fright one or the jam out with a snowman. And there's like one other like secret achievement that I have not dug into to try and figure out what I missed there. But I've also played through and finished the game. So yeah, had you played it at PAX East last year, or were you really only going off of like my experience and like a couple other people who I think talked about it at the time?
You had told me about it, and you were like, this seems like something that'd be up your alley, and so I went to check it out at the Annapurna booth. And so like I only played it for like a second. I didn't do the full like demo, but I kind of just checked it out and saw like other people playing it. But that's why I was definitely interested in it, because I was like, yeah, this totally seems like something up my alley. I thought the little like snippet that I had played was like, hey, I could see that I was into this, but I feel like it serves better as being the entire story.
Yeah.
If that, like, for me. So after having sat down with it and going through the whole thing, I'm like, now I get it. Like, now it really hit home for me, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, that was, I mean, the like thinking back, especially now playing it in context, like the demo that they had was like one of the planets you go on in like the middle of the game. And so you're not like, you're kind of dropped into this world and there's not really like any kind of context for who your character is or anything like that. It was just like, hey, you're dropped in this planet. You're trying to find this jazz club that never appears in the same place twice. So go. And it kind of gives you like the little tutorial of like, here's what you're doing. You're pretty much just going to the right, and then you can press X to shred is what I remember noticing and noting in my kind of like preview of it. Was like, that's when the game got me, is, and you press X and just you start playing this like guitar riff over this like oral soundscape on this random planet that you're on, and as you shred, like things in the background of the environment start doing crazy, like visual psychedelic kinds of things and stuff like that. And it was a really cool experience, but playing it, especially in a PAX demo where I had like no understanding of who this character is or any of this stuff, it was like, this is really cool. I'm curious how this will like fold into a larger narrative and stuff like that. And now that I've seen that, it's like, okay, that was still very much a cool like showpiece, and I get why they use that for the demo, because it's showing off like the key elements of the game of like, here's the cool sound stuff that you're going to get from this game, and here's the cool visuals you're going to get from this game. And you don't necessarily need to worry about the story of this game. The story is there, and it's an interesting, growth, personal journey kind of story, but it was very much like the thing they were showing off at PAX last year was like, here's how cool this thing looks and sounds, and please write up about this and stuff like that. And it worked for me. So now we've both kind of played the full experience. What did you think of the story of young Francis Vendetti?
I loved it. I typically like stories about like, personal growth and finding yourself, and kind of those like coming of age sort of tales. And especially they frequently involve those themes of like, somebody wanting to put you into like a box you don't want to be in, or like being in someone's shadow.
For those that don't know, Francis Vendetti is introduced early on in this game as like basically a legacy kind of like musician, where his uncle was a very Bob Dylan type character, and so everybody is expecting this kid to follow his uncle's footsteps and just be that kind of person, be a folk musician. And like from the very early thing, you get that his heart is not in folk music. He wants to do this crazy rock space opera music, and that's kind of the journey that he goes on, is breaking out of like the world's expectation for him versus what he really enjoys doing and finds passion in.
Yeah, no, and that's a great description, and that's why I really like those themes in other media, and I think obviously it's here, and I really enjoyed it, but I think it's very well done here, and in one of the things also that I enjoyed about it is this is one of those things where the narrative is stronger to me because it is a video game.
Mm-hmm.
And like you get to make some decisions, and it's not like Mass Effect where I'm like impacting the overall story, but it's my journey, it's my flavor text,
Yep.
And even eventually you get to like create a character section, and I spent like 20 minutes in there. I definitely wasted so much time, but I was happy with the guy I came out with,
Same.
And I liked all the options they had, and I liked that some of those options were even like gender fluid-ish. So if that was part of your journey, you could totally do that if you wanted to, and like that's some things that I thought that was like really cool. And that's one of those things when at the end of it, I realized like, yeah, this wouldn't, if you took the same story, it could be a good movie, but this is a great game. Like the fact that this is a game is what makes this better. And that's one of those things that I thought was really awesome.
Yeah, the fact that you are in control of everything. You are in control, because like there's a lot of areas of this game where you can do the platforming and not press X to shred, and it's just like it's a much more barren type of experience because you're not like embracing the input that you as the character player can like put into it. And yeah, that it was fascinating that like this idea of like a mid-game character creation section, because like you've played the first chunk of this game as Francis with kind of his look and his attire, and then you reach this point in the story where it's like, okay, go figure out what you want this character to be. You've already kind of like peppered in like backstory of the closest analog, of course, would be like a Ziggy Stardust or David Bowie. Like you're going from David Bowie to Ziggy Stardust. So you've started creating this like alter ego, this like crazy rock persona of who your character is, and you've like come up with like, this is the planet you were born on, and this is like for in my example, I was like the leader of the like loudest symphony in the world, or like in the universe, or something like that, whatever that narrative was. And those elements will kind of like come up every time you introduce yourself from then on, and it is like you kind of created this narrative and this story for you. And then it is like halfway through the game, you are like, okay, now define your look, figure out, like you could absolutely continue going with this like, hipster folk musician kind of look that you're like given at the beginning of the game, or you can go into just the most outlandish options, and you can do face paint, and you can do kind of like you customize kind of every little bit of the look and feel of this character. And yeah, I also had a ton of fun just kind of like going through that section by section, and then figuring out, okay, like how do these colors and this attire work with like the overall thing that I'm looking to do. And I tweeted out kind of at the end, I was like, here's like, they do a nice little like, you've got everything put together, here's like you on stage. And I basically was like, screenshot that's what I'm going to tweet out when I'm done with this game. And sure enough, I did. I was like, Artful Escape is dope, and here's what my Rockstar version of Francis Vendetti looked like. And it was fun because like I recognize in that moment, like there are probably not going to be a ton of people that created this same iteration of the character. And especially given the like ample customization options. So it very much is like, this is the story you are choosing to tell in a game that admittedly is a little lackluster in the gameplay elements. You and I talked about this a little before we started recording. Like, And I touched on this back when I previewed it, a year and a half ago at PAX. Like, for the most part, it is a very rudimentary platformer. It's mostly a walking simulator. You're just kind of going from left to right. You got a few things to jump over, and then you occasionally have like interactive, basically Simon Says rhythm sections where like you're prompted with like, okay, the creature on the screen is gonna like do these highlighted buttons, and you just need to push those buttons in that order and stuff like that. And it's a very simple base level game if you're looking for like a deep gameplay experience. This is not that. It's much more like, this is an experience that, yes, you're in control of, but like is something just for you to like enjoy and let bombard you with sound and the visuals that are coming at you. Like they're like, even in those Simon Says things, like while I'm basically pushing 5 buttons on my Xbox controller, it is still incredibly hype in the things that I'm doing with those 5 buttons, and the guitar riffs and sounds and the visuals that those things are prompting is often really, really cool. But it is also incredibly simplistic. There's like barely a fail state kind of thing. Like if you mess up some of the platforming, it'll just kind of like roll you back a little bit in the level, and you just kind of like do that section again. There's not like, you can't die in this game. It is very much just like, you're going to go through, you're going to experience this story, and you're going to kind of like Greg Miller often talks about when he talks about like Telltale games, like it's a coloring book that everybody has, and so you're using the same images, but you're coloring it your different colors and stuff like that. It's very much that kind of experience. Everybody's going to go through the same overall narrative. It's just the way their character gets introduced, the way their and the character looks are going to be different from time to, like, at the end of the day, Frank and I did not have a drastically different experience in playing this game. It's just like we colored it in with the different options we selected throughout. So yeah, I really enjoyed it. But I also kind of like was not let down by those drawbacks, because I more than a lot of other people who are hopping into it now for the first time, like I knew to expect those elements because I'd already played this kind of demo. But it is still like, oh, I wish there were more to it versus what we get. Like I think the performances are all great. I think the story is really cool and really great. And again, I can't speak highly enough about the auditory and visual kind of like experience you're just going to go through. It is one of the few things that have made me be like, man, I wish I did drugs. Because it is very much
totally
like
get that.
If you were the kind of person that enjoys partaking in the occasional hallucinatory substance, you will probably get an extra boost and kick out of this game, because it very much is like geared towards those kinds of things. It leans into certain moments where it's like, okay, here's the tripping balls moment of this level that you're in. And as like a person who has never done that, I was still blown away by how this is displayed and how these elements are kind of showcased. And it just made me think like, yeah, based on like my friends who I know have done like acid or LSD or gotten high on other substances, it's just like, oh yeah, these are the kinds of visuals they describe when they talk about those things. So I imagine this would only enhance it.
No, I totally agree with all that. And like I myself, I know like you were just sober playing it, but then I was like, man, I like that would be incredible, like as an experience. And it honestly even kind of harkens back to that age of music that this is kind of going to, where, with like The Wall, where like you can watch that as kind of like a visual spectacle and listen to the music. And a lot of those people or a lot of the fans back then were just impaired, even just on like, being high on weed. But then it's like, I think that's a really cool, another kind of double down as to kind of like the music lineage of the game. Like that's one thing I liked a lot about the game, is the way that it incorporates music, but also not just through the literal music you hear. It's like the whole world is like into music kind of themed. And there's even jokes about like the stores in Calypso are music jokes.
Mm-hmm.
And I forget the vinyl store. I've been trying to remember what it was, but it made me laugh because I totally got it. Like I forget who it referenced, but it's a reference. And I was like, oh, I get it. And then the eyeglass store was called Through the Looking Glass.
Yeah.
And so that's why I was like, oh, this is super fun. And then there's all these other just random like references and humor in here. And that was something that definitely hit for me. I totally agree with you on what you're saying gameplay wise, because based on the demo, I had a little bit limited expectations of what it was too. But I thought it was going to get like more complicated or like, kind of up the game before. That was back with like playing the demo at PAX. So like when I played the snippet of it or just kind of a couple seconds of it, I figured like in talking to you about it, I figured like, okay, towards the end of the game, they'll probably ramp it up a little bit in terms of difficulty or what's going on or what you're doing. But then when I heard before playing it now, like I heard it described as like, this is more of a walking sim. And I was like, oh, that's really interesting. And then to getting into it, I'm like, yeah, it definitely is. It's a very chill game. It is not like pressing you, to be super difficult or to do crazy complicated platforming. I figured out like at the end of the game, you can ground pound and the game just never tells you that that's a thing you can do.
It comes up, I think like the first time you encounter, because like that's what all of the like you'll come across like these areas that are like little circles on the ground that are like lit up things, and I think the first time you encounter it's like, hey, do this ground pound move and you'll like bring in either an amp or you'll do something that like affects the environment in those areas. So it's like it's introduced the one time, but you can completely like not do it moving on. So if you just miss that like bottom prompt at the beginning of the game or whatever, yeah, it's going to be one of those things that like, oh, I just didn't know that I could do that. I had a similar feeling where it's like very late in the game, I was like, oh, I've only been pressing X or whatever to shred, but like you can press a lot of the other buttons that do like the musical prompts that you'll do like throughout the Simon Says portions of the game, and like it'll just riff on different chords or something like that. And I was like, oh, okay, like it wasn't just X that I've had to press this whole time.
Yeah, I thought that was cool because there's definitely a couple moments where like you'll be flying on something or doing something, and then instead of just being like, "Oh, hold X," yeah, it kind of gives you that Simon Says kind of free form of the notes. And I was like, I had fun with that, just hitting all the different buttons and trying to like make something that didn't sound bad, Well,
Yeah.
because the game is very generous, I assume, and like a lot of it sounded great, but I was like, you can definitely, I was like, in like trying to just hit, if you hit the same note over and over again, it's a little bit stilted, or if you like kind of go from like the high note. But I was trying to go like, okay, these are the low notes, these are the high notes. I was trying to like make cool sounds with it, like how Francis Vendetti would have been doing.
Yeah.
But then for me, the fact that the gameplay is a little bit simplistic ultimately didn't take away a ton for the game for me. Because one of the things I kind of thought about during this is like, I think obviously they wanted it to be that way because it's ultimately, I think, more about the narrative. And I think they wanted a lot more people who aren't gamers to experience this.
Mm-hmm.
At least that's how I felt. Because like, I think Annapurna does that a lot, or at least obviously the games that they choose to highlight and like publish. But like I thought of like my sister when playing this because she loves music and she loves Bob Dylan and like David Bowie and like all these things that it kind of this is hearkening to. But she's not a gamer. Like she has a Switch, but she like if it requires something that's like super complicated or there's like a tough boss fight or something, that's kind of like a no-go almost. But then it was something like this where I'm like, no, but I could be like, yeah, just go check this out, and I know you can just beat this game, know, and it's like because it's not going to stop you at all, and that's how I felt about like Sayonara Wild Hearts.
Exactly,
that, like, that was another one I wanted to like highlight for her, where I'm like, hey, you love music. This is like a playable pop album that I really liked, and this is another one where I'm like, hey, this is really cool. Like you will probably like this.
Yeah, the Sayonara Wild Hearts was definitely something I thought about while playing this game. Of like this is an even more simplified Sayonara Wild Hearts, where it is like, okay, you're clearly getting like a soundscape on each of these planets and on each of these kind of like different tracks that you're effectively playing, but you're getting to add like the guitar track to it as you jam out, as you shred throughout the planet and stuff, in a way that like Sayonara Wild Hearts is much more like, okay, like the music is going to play and you're not really going to interact with the music too much, but you're going to do a little bit of like platforming and like like the rhythm game track elements of Sayonara Wild Hearts was like just a little bit more like advanced version of what I felt like I was experiencing here in The Artful Escape.
Yeah, and I definitely agree. And because Sayonara Wild Hearts was interesting, where it is like a whole album front to back that you can play through. And this, I didn't get the feeling that it's like an album, but it's an experience,
Yeah.
like because it's all about the story, the music, the visual, everything. It's just a great experience. And that's one of those things that, like, not only was I kind of in love with it and blown away by it, it is one of those things I would want to highlight to people who are not gamers and who are going to miss this.
Hmm.
Because I was even highlighting it to all the the gamer friends that I have. Like my roommate stopped and was watching me play for a bit. I had another friend over because he's in from out of town and he was watching me for a bit. And like everybody gets like so enraptured by the game just seeing it. And then I'm like, no, but there's actually this really cool like narrative here, and like this is really interesting. And that's one of those things that I would highlight to like non-gamers. It's like, hey, this is something really easy you can enjoy, and it really shows you like what we have and why games are cool.
Yeah.
Because that's one of going back to like my sisters. It's like if I try to talk about something like this, or like the thing that broke her brain was Flower, because I was playing Flower when it came out, and she's like, so you're just a flower? And I'm like, yeah. And she's like, and you don't kill people? And I'm like, yeah. Like they just think it's Gears of War, Call of Duty, like that's all they know.
Yeah.
And that makes sense to them. But when it's something that's not that, they can't, like they're just like confused. But this is one of those things where I'm like, no, you can go through this, experience this, and you can be blown away by the kind of awesome things that like we have going on now.
Yeah, this is absolutely like the art house indie version of a video game,
Yeah.
in every aspect, and obviously the fact that it's an Annapurna game like leads to that already. I also like just as like on a lark, I sat down and like while I was waiting for like Artful Escape or something else to like download, I hopped into Donut County, which is another Annapurna game that I already had like downloaded on the system, and I just kind of hopped back into that for the first time in like a year or something like that. And it was just like, yep, this is just a weird little like indie experience that like is incredibly like outside the norm of like your Call of Duties, your Grand Theft Autos, all that kind of stuff. It very much is like, hey, yep, here's here's a story we're gonna tell you about this musician going through imposter syndrome, and he's going to deal with that by going on this epic space journey, where he's going to play rock music across various alien landscapes. And people are like, none of that makes sense, but okay. uh, and it's just really cool to look at and experience. Yeah, I love that aspect of this game. What did you think of the cast of characters that you kind of meet along the way?
I really enjoyed all the characters. Like, I think ultimately I did really like Francis Vendetti and kind of the journey he goes on. I like Violetta a lot, especially even some of her humor. It was Zom like is barely there, but Zom even was cool. And he's played by Jason Schwartzman, so like that was cool. And then Lightman, like I didn't like dislike him or anything. Like I still liked him enough, but like I didn't like that's one of the ones I'm a little bit more just like man on because like he is there, but he like I thought he's a cool character, but he's kind of like in there in service of the story, if
Yeah.
that makes sense. Where I thought Violetta's like a really cool character.
Okay. Yeah. Lightman is very much the like, he's the guy who's been on this journey with that you're going on before. He did it 50
Mm.
years ago, and he's not like, he's basically been like living off of the fame of that for all this time. And he's like well past his prime and all that stuff, portrayed by Carl Weathers. And I think like him bringing you on as like the opening act for his kind of like dwindling, like going into retirement-esque story was, I think, a really interesting element that then has fun twists and turns and surprises as you go. So I liked him as like an introduction into like what this world can be, and he's the guy who's been through all this before that you're about to go through. And so he's very open and welcoming and kind of like introducing you to that universe, whereas like Zom is this weird like brain creature or whatever, like that like is a much more alien kind of experience and creature, but also is like the first mate of Captain Lightman or whatever on the ship, and does have some very Jason Schwartzman-esque like moments and deliveries and stuff like that. One of the things that like jumped out at me with him, as well as like a number of other things, is I feel like there was probably an earlier iteration of this game that had a lot more characters that you were like doing the Simon Says elements with, because so the for those that don't know, when you encounter like a Simon Says section, you basically have like a character that has kind of like three dots in a triangle and then the two trigger buttons, because the buttons that you're going to be doing are like the X, Y, and I think A, maybe B.
Yeah, it's B. Yeah.
So X, Y, and B on an Xbox controller, and like the left and right bumpers. And so each one of them is like visually represented. And so it's like, oh, if it's the middle button in this like quadrant of 5, it's the, okay, I need to push the Y button. If it's the leftmost button, it's the X. If it's like the top left, it's the left trigger, and the top right, the right trigger, and stuff like that. And so it's like they like a lot of the enemies, or the quote unquote enemies, the like final encounters on a level will have that visual cue included in their design, so that like when that thing lights up, you know what button you're supposed to push to progress forward. And there are a lot more characters that have that aesthetic that you never do kind of these battles with, including the Zom character. So it made me feel like there was probably an earlier iteration where Zom was somebody you had that kind of interaction with at some point, and just for time or the momentum of the game, they maybe eliminated that. But there were like I kept noticing that, whereas like anytime like a new character would be introduced, I would see that like pattern in them and be like, okay, like I'm preparing myself for the Simon Says minigame or whatever, and then it wouldn't come, and I was like, oh, okay, all right, I guess this was just a person I met along the journey. All right, cool. So yeah, I definitely thought that with him. He also is very like almost dismissive of you as a human, because he is this like weird character that like you really only see like the brain, and then he's kind of got like a buggish kind of body around his, like he is the first alien you meet in this game. It's like, okay, this guy definitely sets a different tenor from everybody else you meet. And then you see a ton of other, wild, outlandish things that like he is kind of like eased you into a little bit. But yeah, I like Lightman, and Lightman in particular, I think is the standout of the supporting characters for me, just because he is kind of playing that like mentor role for a lot of the game. But Violetta also, I think, as like one of the first characters you meet that kind of like brings you into this world, is I almost like, I basically described her when I was originally playing through it as like almost that like pixie dream girl character that you like, that so many kind of like 20 something protagonists have met in the movies, like most iconically maybe like Zoe Saldana from not Zoe Saldana, Zoe Deschanel from 500 Days of Summer, is very much that like, you've met this character is going to spark something in your protagonist and let you go on this journey, and whether or not that turns into like a romantic thing or not is moot. That's not the point. It's just, this person is like the quirky, like out there character that like awakens something in you. And she very much gave me those kinds of vibes. But I love where her story kind of goes over the course of the game as well.
Yeah, I totally agree with that, because I think out of the supporting characters, she was my favorite. Like I thought I loved like what her story is, and even when they kind of have that moment when he's like, "What are you hiding from?" and he kind of like hits her with that, like you're amazing, but you're just like hiding here. And that's like a whole its own, like she has her own like growth there. And I guess I just want to clarify too, like I didn't dislike anybody, like I definitely did like everybody, and like I think they tell a great story. But that was like, those were just kind of my favorites. I also, favorite random character was the street musician you can talk to at the beginning of the game. Did you talk to him like when you're in Calypso, like before you leave?
The guy who's like, I want to say he's got like red hair, he's dressed up in a suit or something like that.
I think so, because he's the one like playing guitar, and he has like his guitar open, he's like busking.
Yes,
and he basically like kind of shits on you, where he's like, talent's not hereditary and blah 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 blah. And then I just love that Francis was like, well, it's great to get the opinion of somebody so known in the music industry. And he like walks out. I was like, this game's hilarious.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's like the other, like the skiffer band or whatever, that's like, that is like so pretentious about their own stuff, like the Beatles started in skiffing or whatever. It's like, all right, but nobody knows the Beatles for skiffing. So And it was like one of those things of like, I don't even know what skiffing means as somebody who's like playing this game for the first time. But they're absolutely like the pretentious hipster douchebag kind of like band is like, I very much like and this will go out whenever we do the because I played like the first hour or so. Basically, I think I played up through like the first like trip through the cosmic voyage or whatever. I don't remember what the name of it is at this point, but it was like the first, like I played all the Calypso stuff, and then I played up through like the first planet that you go to, probably just for like a, hey, here's like what this game has in store for you for a let's play. And so yeah, I went through and like I talked to all those Calypso people, and I was like, cool. Like I almost was like mildly disappointed that like I didn't then reconnect with them throughout the journey. It very much is like you meet all these people and they kind of like set up who your character is at the beginning and who you're expected to be, but then like you really don't ever encounter them again on your journey through this the you know the universe or whatever. And so it was like yet it's always in the back of Francis's mind, and there are moments throughout the story where he's like he doesn't do things because he doesn't want to like portray this version of himself to them as an audience, that I thought was, you know, interesting. It very much is that like dealing with expectations that are put on you versus who you really think you are and who you really want to be and stuff like that. So yeah, I enjoyed those, but it was also like they were such a small portion of the game that like a lot of them I was like I have an image of them, but I would not have been able to pull like the reference in the line that you like when you said it. I was like, yes, I remember that joke and that bit. And same with some of those shops early on. Like I comment as I go through that let's play of like I'm reading the shop names and you know like laughing at some of the jokes and stuff like that. And some of them, I'm probably not catching whatever references are being made. It's just like I don't understand what that means, but okay. But yeah, it was like it's such a, and admittedly, it's only like a 4 to 5 hour kind of experience, but it's like that first hour. By the time you've gone on all these other things in this journey, it's like, oh yeah, I didn't remember like that. All that very pedestrian stuff that you get introduced in this game kind of goes flying out the window as soon as you go into space and you're dealing with like giant space creatures and trying to rock out with them, the Glamourgons and stuff like that of the universe. There's one element that I'm still curious about. I'm like, I don't know what they were going for here, and I don't know if you encountered this, but like on the Cosmic Lung, which is basically like the hub world ship that you continually return to throughout the game. In the bottom level, there's like a coat rack shop, and like every time you go and talk to them, they like have a little line, and then they shut down the shop. And it's like I feel like that didn't have like the culmination of beats that I was hoping for it to have. What did you experience any of that kind of stuff as well?
Yeah, yeah, because I pretty much talked to everybody that I could whenever I could. It's funny that now that you mention it, I only did it the first time, and I never talked to that guy again because like he closed the thing, so I never like went back there or really thought about it. But it's funny that I guess that's like a reoccurring bit.
He'll give you
But
like
yeah,
a new line or something like as you progress each time or whatever, and you go back down there and like the shop's back open and you go and thing, and he'll like it'll be an evolution of like the, you know, checking your coat kind of idea or mentality or whatever. But then like after you talk to him, shuts it down. It's like, okay, I can't talk to that guy again. Oh, all right. I okay. And I was like, it's just a weird beat to encounter in these games, but this game is filled with weird beats like that.
I wonder if that was another like cut thing that like maybe that was like originally something more, or that could have even maybe been a fun thing if you could jam with that guy at some point.
Mm-hmm.
But that's what that because that it reminded me playing this reminded me sometimes of that game After Party.
Mm-hmm.
But this I thought was obviously like a lot stronger and just everything it tries to do, or even just the narrative and the jokes and stuff. But it definitely reminded me sometimes of like how like After Party has a ton of that cut content that could have made it like a stronger experience. And even in this, like I think maybe, I mean, obviously it's hard to say, but I think maybe they were just looking for like pacing or something, because I think the pacing in the game is really good. Like I at no point ever felt like it was slow or coming to a crawl. And if anything, I wanted more. but that's kind of what they want. They want to leave you wanting more. They don't want it to just be like me. But I was like, I'm kind of with you where I'm like, I wish I could have got more with the NPCs, and even just like, there have been cool if there was more aliens you could talk to, because you can talk to them, but like you don't get those kind of that quality of the interactions like you do in Calypso.
Yeah.
Like after you leave. And then the only time you do see those people from Calypso again is like in the cutscene, but you don't get to interact or talk. They don't say anything. They're just there. And I remembered the old woman, and she kind of like is there at the end, and I was like, oh, okay, that's cool. But like, I'm like, that could have even been more, or like I'm kind of with you where I wish I could have gotten more from that too. For me, even the one I kept thinking about was his mom. Like, he doesn't talk about her ever again the rest of the game, and I get why, but I'm like, he is always like, oh, fuck Calypso, and I'm like, bro, your mom is there. Like, you literally have family in Calypso. Like, if it was just you, I could get it, but I'm like, she was very nice. Like, we got to talk to her. Like, she was nice.
There's that. There's also like you can go at his house early in the game or whatever. You can see like a picture of like his dad with his uncle or whatever, and he like even makes kind of mention of like, nobody really talks about my dad ever or anything like that, and also you never talk about your dad ever. So it's like. So, like, was there at some point in this development something more there that ultimately made the chopping block or something like that? But all those, like, I would say minor quibbles in the story that is presented is still a very fun, engaging experience. Even if there are like setups for things that maybe never get a payoff necessarily, but sometimes that's like ultimately okay, I guess, because they're also all like optional setups. Like, you didn't have to talk to any of those people as you were like in the Calypso section. You can go walk through that entire thing and just go to like the whatever the house at the end, and never like engage with any of those people and deal with that. Like, some of them are even off the beaten path of like, okay, here's clearly I'm supposed to go up this thing, but I'm going to keep going a little bit further. And, I'm now talking to this other band of the skiffers or whatever. And they're like laying their judgment on me. And I could have completely missed that if I had, taken the initial path earlier or something like that. So, I think even in the Let's Play, I talk about like, I walk to the end of like I think in the middle level of Calypso or something like that. I walk to the leftmost section, and like I see behind one of the stores or something like that, I see like a couple of women kind of necking and making out. I'm like, good for you guys. You go. And it's like, there's like, I don't engage with them at all. It's just like, they're NPCs in the background of this level. I'm like, oh, cool. Like, that I could have completely missed, because if I hadn't gone like far enough to the left on that level or something like that. So, cool little things like that. But yeah, ultimately there were a handful of instances of like, it would have been interesting to see like a follow up to some of those relationships. Like, I mean, like, one of the ones that I was surprised didn't become more of a thing is like the I think Moby or Mofi or something, like whatever the guy who's basically, it's his equipment at the beginning.
Romy. Yeah.
Romy. Yeah. There you go.
Yeah.
Like, he does this whole like intimidating, like I'm smiling, but you should also know that if you screw this up, I will kill you, kind of like, he gives you like this intimidating speech, and then you just never deal with him again until that same final cutscene at the end, where it's like, you see him pop up because you recognize that character model from 5 hours ago, but like there was never that beat never gets closed. It's just kind of like an introduced thing, and that's it. So yeah, interesting choices in that regard, but ultimately it's still like a cool experience, even despite all of those things. I can't speak enough about how like auditorially and visually this game looks really cool, and I think they do a really good job of the camera zooming in at the right moments and stuff like that, and focusing on the right beats and highlighting the right beats, and then just stuff in the background is just going bonkers, and you'll have the alien equivalent of fireworks or something as you're like running through an area. It's like, I could completely not be paying attention to it, but the fact that I saw that out of the corner of my eye just was a really cool visual that I just experienced because I'm pushing X and just shredding, playing the guitar through this cosmic landscape stuff.
It, that was something I did definitely really enjoyed too, because obviously that's where you get a ton of the beautiful visuals, and that was what makes so much of the game for me. But the actual guitar music when you're riffing like that seems to really line up with like the background music really well.
Mm-hmm.
Like sometimes, like especially when you get to a beautiful set piece, like if you're not shredding, there's like this kind of other like orchestral music that sometimes is there that are like build or swell up. But then when you start riffing, for me at least, and I could be wrong, it just sounded a lot of the times like that is like syncing up like with the background music and making like an even different, like better track. And that
Mm-hmm.
was something that I was constantly like blown away by, because like if I just stayed in an area standing still and then was doing it, it kind of just sounded like a guy riffing. But in those moments, it sounded like like it was syncing up with the actual like backing track.
Yeah, I
And
definitely
that's what I
think.
thought was really cool.
Yeah, I definitely think it is like lined up that they have that track kind of like laid out on the level, and the guitar is basically like a toggle on and off based on if you're shredding or not, and but they do a cool thing of like, it if you're not playing and then you start playing, it'll like riff into that track that you're playing, and then so if you're just holding the thing, you'll hear everything, but then if you like drop out and then come back in a couple seconds later, it'll just kind of like pick back up at that part, and you'll have missed, the couple seconds there where you weren't riffing. But it's very much like it does feel absolutely complimentary to that. It's not just like, oh, this is just conveniently really cool electric guitar over this other soundscape that you're hearing otherwise. It does very much feel like that is the electric guitar on that track that you just kind of control whether or not it's there or not. And if it's not there, it still sounds cool. But if it is there, it sounds like this epic, extra epic thing. I want to give a shout out to our friend over at Point in Progress, Mario Rivera, who published a video review of the game that touched on kind of, I think, a lot of the beats that you and I have already touched on. But he also drew the comparison to Bill and Ted's Excellent Adventure kind of storytelling, because it's very much like there's a very Wild Stallions vibe to the just like, I'm going to rock out on this guitar right now kind of vibe, which is just really cool.
I got that a lot with the name too. Like whenever they say your name and then it just goes into the guitar riff, and I'm like, that's very Bill and Ted when they would just add that guitar riff in.
Yeah. The Almighty instead of Trevor, it's like the Almighty. Yeah. Ton of fun, and I appreciate that as the, like, since we, obviously there are a ton of games out there where you can put your own name in there or whatever, and the characters are never going to say your name in the game. So I appreciate that they had like a workaround for that of like, here's your name in cosmic guitar, and how that translates. And it might be the same for, everybody. Like Trevor might sound exactly the same as Frank sounds, but it's still like cool because you're seeing your name or whatever name you've put in there up on the screen, but you're hearing this like guitar riff that becomes like synonymous with your name or that name by the end of the game. Because it's like, for me, it was like, I am the almighty Trevor, like born from Von Deladon, from the planet Von Deladon, and I'm the leader of the loud symphonic orchestra or whatever, whatever that selection of kind of like background character creator stuff that I had made. So like hearing that every time is like, yeah, that is me, I'm awesome. And just had a fun time with it. So very cool. Yeah.
So I'm totally with you there, and I think even hearing you say that though, I think it's so funny because like you pick completely different options than I picked, because like obviously like I put in Frank for my name, but then I went with the alliteration, so I did Furious Frank. I'm gonna be honest with everybody, I was gonna put Furious 7 just like Fast and the Furious, but I was like, but 7 isn't like a name, so I just put my name in, and then. But I did the planet or like the galaxy of Nesbeam because the description said that it conjures beings of greatness and sometimes villainy. Nice. And I was like, oh, that's funny. And I was like, so I went with that. And then I was the first soloist of the intergalactic transmission. I was the soloist of the world's first like intergalactic transmission. And I was like, And I was just picking these things, but it's so cool that, yeah, like the rest of the game, all the way until the end, like that was me. He's like, yeah, I am this being and I did all these things. And I was like, I really loved that. And like the flavor text, like on top of it.
Yeah, absolutely. That again ties into that Greg Millerism of like, here's the coloring book that like it's the same image we're all looking at, but where I have blue, red, and green, you have orange, purple, and yellow, or something like that. And it's a cool little like, oh, here's how our experiences end up being different as a result. Very cool. Any so you had like Psychonauts as kind of your game of the year so far, and then you played Artful Escape, and that maybe has shot up to a little bit past Psychonauts in this. We'll see where that ultimately shakes out by year's end. But any final thoughts here on Artful Escape before we move on?
Just one last quick thing. I think we kind of touched on it a bit, but I also just thought this game was really funny. At least for me, like the humor hit a lot, and in comparison to Psychonauts, which also has a ton of humor, which I also thought hit. But the way I think of Psychonauts is like it is just this Gatling gun of humor and jokes that it is firing at you nonstop, like between the sight gags, the characters gags, like people's reactions, visuals. It's like it's hitting you with a lot, and not all of it hits. But for me here, it was the exact opposite, where it's like, no, we like wrote some like really specific jokes that you can even just bypass and ignore. But it's like that thing of like, oh, these are all really fun and clever, and like it's playing off of either music or just the world or something like that. So that was just something that I enjoyed a lot. Like I said, I enjoyed all those. Like, and to our point, once you leave Calypso, you get kind of less and less and less of that. But I really like, there's a ton of just like really fun humor for me in there that I thought this was like a really funny game.
Oh yeah, I mean, like I still had fun, like on the Cosmic Lung again, that ship that you go back to, like going up to the onboard bar or something like that, and the
Yeah.
person not wanting to serve you, even though your like renown is growing over the course of the game, and still being like, hey, we're still not going to serve you because you're too young or whatever, and we're a cosmic bar where you need to be at least this old or whatever. Like I appreciated that, like there was a lot of fun like interactions and banter in those opportunities. So yeah, there were a lot of fun, just like throwaway gags, as well as like this is a clearly a comedic beat that they were targeting for you on. The last little thing I'll say about Artful Escape for me is I loved this game and this experience despite not being a huge music guy. Like I've talked about this, I think, in some of our past podcasts and stuff like that. Like music is just, it's not one of my preferred mediums of entertainment. I'm much more of a video game guy, and a like the music I listen to is most often music from musicals. I'm rarely going in and listening to like random songs, or like I barely ever do Spotify and any of that kind of stuff. So like and even in those veins, like I'm a child of like the 90s and early aughts in terms of like alternative music or whatever. So like the real touchstones that this game is touching on of your Bob Dylan aesthetic with the folk music, and then going into like the Ziggy Stardust, David Bowie stuff, just like I have so little connection to any of those that I like. There was no like personal investment from them, but I still had a cool time. And even going back to like playing it a year and a half ago at PAX, like the first time you're rocking out on the guitar, it is immediately flashbacks to those air guitar sessions I would play as a kid and be like, yeah, I'm gonna rock out, and listening to any kind of like guitar track and just being like, yeah, this is like, I'm gonna be epic right now. Despite the fact that I'm not normally that guy, and it's not an experience I'm ever like seeking out, I still had a great time with this. So shout out to the game being able to kind of like circumvent and supersede maybe some of those like predestined expectations in an experience like this. So moving on, last game I want to talk about a little bit. We won't probably spend too much time on this, just because I know you have not delved into this one, Frank. But it's been a very busy weekend for me, because like Friday night I played Artful Escape pretty much all in one sitting. And then yesterday, Saturday, as we're recording this, I played through Life is Strange True Colors all in one sitting. And Life is Strange True Colors a significantly longer experience than Artful Escape. Artful Escape like maybe 4 to 5 hours total, whereas Life is Strange is a typical Life is Strange game in that it is 5 chapters long, and each chapter is like 2 to 3 hours, depending on how involved you get and how much like of the kind of like nooks and crannies you dive into in the game. So yeah, I was playing that up until like 4 in the morning last night because I just couldn't put it down. I especially wanted to like finish it up before we sat down and recorded today. Because I could have come in here and been like, here's what my thoughts are on like the first 3 chapters of Life is Strange True Colors is, but I wanted to kind of just enjoy the full thing kind of all in one go. And I know like it's another one that I don't know yet where this will ultimately fall on my Game of the Year conversation, but it's currently easily in the top 10. And as I was telling Frank a little bit before we started recording, like, as somebody who's played Life is Strange 1 and 2, not before the storm, but now True Colors, this is my favorite Life is Strange game. And I really enjoyed Life is Strange 1 and 2. Both of them were like top of the list in their respective years. And True Colors, I think, is a better version than both of those games. I think the characters that you are encountering are the most engaging and pardon the pun, but most colorful that I've experienced in a Life is Strange game. And I will also even like kind of like throw in the extra Tell Me Why game from last year. That was a Don't Not game, not in the Life is Strange vein, but very much had Life is Strange elements to it. I was blown away by the characters in this game, the story that's being told, and this easily leaps and bounds is the best looking Life is Strange game that we've had. Character models are phenomenal, kind of across the board, and there are like a ton of like just close-up scenes on them, where like you're seeing like every detail of a character's face, that would have felt a little bit more like plastic or like you see the cracks and the seams in previous versions of Life is Strange games, but like when it is Alex, zoomed in on Alex's face while she's like playing a guitar song or something like that, it's like, oh, she looks like really, really good as a character model just in general. And then taking it up to the city that you kind of are planted in here of Haven, I think Haven Springs or something like Haven something, is just like a beautiful little town. And it's basically like, a main street of a town where you can go into like a few different locations or something like that. But there's such beautiful detail put into that I just had a great time kind of exploring and walking around this little like segment of town and going into each of these little shops and stuff like that. Was a ton of fun. It has a, typically phenomenal soundtrack from Life is Strange, both in the licensed music that it kind of pulls in here, as well as just kind of the more, in this case, Deck 9 kind of like featured numbers that they're bringing in here. And the story itself has like each chapter, I think, does a great job. And to the benefit of this one, all 5 chapters are released at once. It's not like here's chapter 1 and now you have to wait 2 months, 3 months for the next chapter. They held everything off and you can play the whole game now, which is a huge benefit because that's how I've always played these games in the past anyway. And so I appreciate that I didn't have to like wait another 6 months to finish this story ultimately. But like each chapter does a great job of telling the specific chunk of this story that it's looking to tell. And chapter 3 in particular is a ton of fun. And I don't want to necessarily spoil it, but they change up the gameplay in certain elements, apart from like the normal walking simulator Life is Strange element, like to very loosely kind of like frame it. A couple of your characters in this town are really into LARPing, and they basically kind of create a LARP within the town. And so like there are parts of chapter 3 that just you're playing through that LARP. And so instead of being like walking simulator, they turn almost into like a turn-based like Final Fantasy type game, turn-based RPG kind of game, and the way that evolves over the course of the chapter is just really fun and engaging, and some of the most fun I've had this year. As especially as a fan of that genre already going into it, it's like that and like a dragon from Yakuza. It's like how did like both of those came at like the JRPG model from completely different levels, and I love them both. I had a ton of fun just kind of like engaging and just hanging out with a lot of characters in this particular Life is Strange. And I'm very interested in like hopping back in and playing like other approaches and seeing how other things would have influenced the overall story, because there are definitely some things where it's like, oh, I thought I was making this decision, but really it had this other ripple effect that I wasn't anticipating. And so now that I've kind of seen the end product, it'll be interesting to go back and make other decisions and see how those affect things ultimately. But yeah, just a ton of fun with this. And like I texted Logan after I finished chapter 2 and was like teared up already. I was like this is already on par to be my favorite Life is Strange game. And then I texted him another like 7 hours later, whatever, like, yep, just finished it. It was phenomenal, start to finish. Had a great time. Easily my top Life is Strange story. So I know as he is also a Life is Strange fan, I hope he is able to sit down and check it out. Have you played any of the Life is Strange games, Frank?
So far, I've only played the first one,
Mhm.
and I played it around the time. I actually watched somebody stream it around the time it came out, and then I played it when it was like free on PlayStation Plus, maybe like a year or two later.
Mhm.
And the whole story was already out. But I with this one, I'm glad you definitely. I know you're obviously a fan of the whole Life is Strange series, but I'm glad you definitely really enjoyed this one because from what I've heard, it sounds like this is a particularly really strong entry in that series. I was just curious because going back to the coloring book thing, like of how all those decisions can kind of color the path in the story. I heard that this one in particular does that very well. Do you have any like? I know you kind of touched on that there, but do you have any like thoughts on like that?
I mean, like definitely there are certainly elements of like, so Alex is your main character, Alex Chen, and her power this time, her power in this game is and like this was out in the trailers, and I remember like when this and was announced, I was like, that's an interesting superpower compared to rewinding time and telekinesis that we've seen in previous Life is Strange games. I'm curious how this will work out, but she's basically like a super empath, where if somebody is feeling an emotion to an extreme degree, like rage or incredible sorrow or something like that, she can see an aura around that person, and she kind of like hones in on them and can feel exactly what they're feeling and see basically the world through their eyes.
That's cool.
And that ends up leading to some very interesting kind of like incorporation of those powers. Like the one of the first times that really gets introduced is this kid is like, you're helping this kid who's incredibly scared, and you're trying to kind of connect with him and help him, like help save him from his fear. And so you have to see what he's seeing to really understand why he's so afraid of these things, because a lot of it's all in his head. And so making that connection with him and kind of seeing the world through his eyes, I think does a great job of kind of like personifying that ability, and that because you can, I mean, like to your broader question there, like from the broader coloring book thing, it's introduced very early on that you're talking about, when you talk about this ability, that you can talk about it as a superpower or as a curse. And
Mm.
like I chose to talk about it as a superpower and embrace it as a superpower and try and use it as a superpower. But I imagine you can go a very completely different route where you are looking at this more negatively, and you're seeing it as a curse on yourself, and that will color, again, pardon the pun, how you interact with other characters when discussing this ability, and when thinking about this ability as well. Um, Additionally, like when you kind of like hone in on a person, not only can you hone in on that person's feelings, but you can hone in on items around them. And like
Mm.
you'll get kind of like, so like in this case, this kid was scared and his backpack is nearby, and these comic books that he's drawn are nearby, and you can kind of like focus on each of those items to help to give you new context for why he's scared or whatnot. And in doing so, you'll get additional dialogue options that you can use to try and like calm the kid down and like alleviate the tension that he's feeling in those moments and stuff like that. So
That's
so
cool.
there it's a cool little like yeah, it's just a cool extra like, oh, now like I have because I have this like ability, this empath ability, super empath, I can like see this thing that is very precious to this other character, and I can focus in on that, and I'll be introduced to a new memory that that character has tied to that item that they might not have otherwise introduced to me or been open with and forthcoming with. So the fact that I now have this memory in my head, I can kind of like steer a conversation to talk about that, or to lead them to open up about that idea, as opposed to if I didn't focus in on that item or something like that, my choices are going to be limited. I might not have the full range of conversation and dialogue options that I could. So yeah, that's I think from the like, here's how you manage the coloring book, how you handle each of these different kind of scenarios, and how you try and like alleviate the emotion that these people are feeling, because ultimately like if somebody is like super angry, you're trying to become an empath to them to calm them down and like remove that anger from them. And as your powers grow over the course of the game, you can very literally take that rage from them if you want, and that will then like impact how you react to things in the future, because like you've eliminated the rage from them, so you can kind of like finish the conversation out, but now this rage lives in you, and you might end up lashing out at another character because of that, because you made that decision or something like that. So so there are a few opportunities where it goes to like that level, like the power kind of evolves to that degree, where you can not only in the moment feel these things that these characters are feeling, but you can kind of like remove that feeling from them to alleviate them of the issue, but then that may or may not take a toll on you as Alex. So so I think it's another one that does a great job. They do a great job kind of in the like every chapter, as Life is Strange has always done. Like here's here are the choices we've kind of identified and tracked, and here's how many people made this choice, just like Emily is Away 3 earlier this year. Here's how many people made this choice versus how many people made this choice. And there are a lot of choices in there because the game doesn't necessarily handhold you to go and explore every element. So there might be a lot of choices at the end of a chapter of like, you met this person on the rooftop, or you met this other person on the rooftop, or you didn't even go to the rooftop. And you might see those kinds of reactions of like, oh yeah, I didn't even think to go to the rooftop. So apparently there's a whole other scene I could have had if I'd done that. Or you didn't go to the flower shop, or those kinds of things. So, so it does an interesting job at that level. It's much like I would also kind of compare it to Detroit Become Human a few years back, where it was like, you see kind of in Detroit Become Human, you see kind of the grid of like, here's how everything plays out to the final choice you made, but you can see in that grid all the other choices that you didn't make. And you see that to a degree in kind of the chapter wrap up summary things of like, oh, okay, that's a different way I could have played this out. And 33% of the people played it out that way. I'm curious how that scene would have played out if I had made those choices. And then a whole bunch of them are also just like like probably non-consequential. Like, oh, you cleaned up the weeds on the rooftop garden versus you didn't. That that might come into play, and if you go up to the rooftop garden in the next chapter, it'll be a little bit more of a mess. But it's not like affecting, you know, the relationships with the townspeople or something like that. Versus like, oh, you made a connection with this townsperson that then, like, by the time the end game kind of rolls around, affects whether or not that person stands up for you or not when you maybe need them to. So yeah, there's a lot of cool, like, this will affect this thing down the line elements of the story, as is often the case in these Life is Strange type games. And I'm very curious to go back and like try playing through again and seeing how different decisions might make different characters stand up for me or ally with me by the end or something like that. So yeah, really, really engaging coloring book kind of stuff. I think ultimately there's probably still, I mean, it very much is that, in that I don't think, I mean, even in this, comparing it to like the first Life is Strange that has two like very disparate endings, I don't think that opportunity exists. I don't think there's not a, like, if you do this one ending, the entire town is going to be destroyed, versus if you do this other ending, you're going to be fine. It's a much more personal relationship with these characters, but depending on the relationships you build with these characters over the course of, you know, 10 to 12 hours or whatever it is, you might, like, one of those characters betraying you or turning on you might have a very visceral impact that you might not have expected or experienced otherwise. So, yeah, I think it's just, it is pumping on all cylinders. The writing is really good. The performances are all great. And again, it looks beautiful especially compared to like Life is Strange games in the past. Playing them now, you know, these games are, you know, 5-6 years old or whatever. So hopping into, you know, Life is Strange 1 now, oh yeah, Max doesn't necessarily look like a 2021 character. Alex looks like a 2021 character, and I think they do a great job of that. There were like a few little bugs here and there that I know, like, Kind of Funny has talked similarly about these, like, you know, you go into it. They mentioned in their review, like, they went, like, both Greg and Blessing, I think, went into the same scene and a character was like in a T-pose. And I'm like, I wonder if it was this exact same scene where I encountered the character in a T-pose. So there's like a few instances like that. And there's a few frame rate, like, dips, but really only in like the first chapter. Like, I don't know if it's just there's a lot more going on under the hood in that first chapter. But like once you get into chapters 2 through 5, like, the game ran incredibly smoothly and just looked beautiful start to finish. Or maybe I just stopped noticing those things. But there are a few graphical hiccups, but I kind of also expect those from a game the size of Life is Strange. But they're also working on, like, I saw they've been tweeting out that they're working on these, like, some upcoming patches in the next few weeks that will try and fix and alleviate some of those issues as well. But yeah, worth noting that, like, it's not gonna, like, while it looks beautiful, there are gonna be some issues here and there. Like, there were a handful of times where, like, an audio line just dropped out, and I was playing with the subtitles on so I could see the dialogue that was happening, but the audio just didn't finish. So it's like, okay, well, I still got the premise and the idea of what is going on in the scene. But yeah, really good time overall. I had a great time with this.
I'm definitely glad to hear, because everything you've said, it kind of has me a lot more interested in it. And especially because, like, when I think we kind of covered it, but one of the things I was curious about is like how open it is, because I heard that it seems like obviously it's kind of telling you this A to B story, but I did hear that it's a little bit more open in terms of like these characters you can talk to, and you can definitely, like, obviously be like, well, I aligned with these characters, so I furthered the relationship with them. And then if you ignore these other characters, it's like that actually does have a big impact, like, on the actual, like, story or the outcomes. And that's something I think is a lot more interesting, or, you know, it's cool to play with, especially because, like you said, I think that does go back to the replayability, and it definitely probably benefits it. But even for me who hasn't played it, that has me a lot more interested to play it, because I kind of like, to use your other comparison there, like I kind of like that it is a little bit more about these interpersonal relationships, and it's not just like, is the town destroyed or not?
Yeah.
You know, like it's not this big climactic event. It can be very interpersonal, and it's about a community.
Yeah.
And like that sounded very, very appealing and interesting to me. But as like a Persona fan, like I know that sounds deeper than Persona, but I'm cool with that. We can take Persona deeper, and you can have these social links with like characters and kind of build those relationships. And yeah, and I think it's cool that then like, then like if when somebody else who's mad at you because of something it costs you, somebody else will have your back because of something you did. Like I think that's like definitely super cool, and I'm glad to hear that.
Yeah, in that vein, so the game kind of, like, the game will give you, like if you go into the menu screen or whatever, it'll give you like, here are the main objectives that you need to kind of progress the story, and then it'll also introduce as like, as you read kind of like character texts or something like that, or they also have kind of like they call it My Block, but it's basically like a Facebook kind of post thing on your phone, where like you might be introduced to other ideas or other things that kind of like, you've got your kind of like main objectives and then secondary objectives that you can also do. But then there are other things that are just kind of like, hey, it's not a main or secondary objective, but if you go find this person in this particular chapter, you'll, encounter dialogue with them that might ultimately affect their decisions one way or another. But it's not like, the game's not like saying, hey, also go talk to this other person, like be sure you do that. It is so you can have chapters in the game that are like, hey, the main thrust of this chapter is taking place around this event, but if you leave that event and like go to the flower shop, people will still be there at the flower shop, and you can kind of interact with them and engage with them in conversation. And that's going to be like main characters, but it's also just like random NPCs. Like there's like a pair of NPCs that you can kind of encounter throughout the chapters of the game, and it's like a guy and a girl who clearly like each other, but they're both afraid to kind of like make their feelings known, so they're just kind of going on as friends. And you, using your empath powers, can kind of like see and feel, like hear what they're thinking about the other person, and like very quickly uncover, okay, like he likes her and she likes him, but they're both afraid of like what that will happen, what they'll do to their friendship if they, encounter it or whatever. And if you like continue to circle back to them over the course of the game, and kind of like continue to like pick up on those beats, by the end of the game, you'll maybe get a prompt that says like, hey, like you guys are such a cute couple or something like that. Like you're not exposing this idea to these completely random characters that like you can read their minds and know that each of them like each other. You can just kind of like give the prod that they need to like actually engage in a relationship or something like that. So like saying like, hey, you guys look like a cute couple. It's, it's great always seeing you around. And them and one of them's like, wait, like us being referred to as a couple doesn't bother you? And she's like, no, I'm okay with it. And they're like, and then like I love how that pays off, because then they kind of post on that social media thing, and other characters in the game will comment and be like, it's about time. And they'll be like, did everybody know but us? And so there's just like, and that's a completely like tangential, has no ultimate bearing on the story. It's not like those characters are going to come and stand by you at the end climactic, decisions or anything like that. It's just like you've encountered these random NPCs in this town over the course of the game, and you've had a story blossom with them over the course, because you've encountered them chapter over chapter, if you manage to find them kind of across those chapters. And there's a ton of fun just in that. There were definitely things like from chapter 1, whereas like a character kind of introduces himself to me and is like, hey, if you want to, like grab a drink at the bar, let me know. And I forgot to circle back around to him and grab a drink at the bar with him. And there was even a prompt of like, hey, have you done everything you want to do? And I was like, yep, I'm good. And then immediately it was like, oh no, I didn't grab a drink with that guy. Crap. I missed that opportunity. So I'll have to like, catch that the next time I play or something like that. So yeah, I think there's a ton of joyous discovery in that regard of like, these are things that you can completely miss, but there's such a richness there of if you do dig a little deeper to some of these characters and some of these relationships. And then also in that same vein, the typical like, do you want to do this or do you want to do this? And they're like, obviously those like big choices in the game, they do a great job of being like, it's not like this is clearly the good choice and this is clearly the bad choice. It is much more like gray areas of gray of like, how do you want to handle this situation? In some of these cases, neither of these options are great, but like you got to pick one of them. So what do you want to do here? How do you want this to play out? Like, this person has confided in you, and do you want to like hold up their trust, or do you need like, because they're saying something that might hurt them or might be, be dangerous to them, do you decide to tell these other people, hey, heads up, this is what's going on with this other person? Or do you keep that other person secret? Like, those are the kind of choices you get to make. And I love that. I love that it wasn't just like, it wasn't very clear cut, like, here's the good option, here's the bad option. It was very much like, a number of times I was like, oh God, which of these do I want to do? Which of these would I do in this case? I can like immediately in my head, I can see how both of these are going to spin out into, like, if I tell this person, they're probably not going to trust me, or they're going to have trust issues with me over the course of, the rest of the next 4 chapters because I'm making this decision in chapter 1. But also, I don't want this person to die because they're doing a reckless thing or something like that. So do I tell somebody on them? Do I kind of tattletale or whatever? And I think the game does a great job of kind of like making those decisions murky and like tough decisions compared to like Infamous. This is clearly the good decision. This is clearly the bad decision. It is a much more kind of like fields of gray area that you're playing in, and was just a kind of a great for narrative choice in there. And again, tying back to the whole idea of like, here's how your coloring book is going to play out. In some cases, you deciding to kind of tell this person's secret makes that person not like you, but you might also be able to save that down the line and explain why you made that decision or something like that. So lots of good stuff there in Life is Strange True Colors. And again, I can't speak enough to how good this game looks for a Life is Strange game, and how good and strong the writing is, and just the character performances are also all phenomenal. Like, I don't think I knew any of these like actors going into this, but like all across the board, like every character is just like exactly hitting on all cylinders for what that character should be doing. So shout out to Life is Strange True Colors. The last little thing I want to touch on here is a musical that just made its way to Apple TV Plus. This is a musical that came out, I want to say like 2016, 2017, something like that. It's a musical called Come From Away. Much like Hamilton for Disney Plus last year, they basically filmed a version of Come From Away and have put it up on Apple TV Plus. And it's a musical I had heard good things about, but I'd never actually sat down and like listened to or watched. But sitting down and watching it on Apple TV Plus, the premise of this musical, for those that don't know, is on September 11th, 2001, a series of planes that were in the air basically got rerouted to this very small town in Newfoundland, Canada, called Gander. And this is based on a true story musical about the people on those planes and the people of this 7,000, 9,000 person town, Gander, suddenly having to deal with like this massive influx of people who are stranded in a country that's not their own, because of the events of September 11th. And the townspeople just kind of like come together and do all the goodness they can to try and like make these people feel as home. They feed these people, they clothe these people, they give them shelter because they don't know when they're going to be able to get back on their planes and fly out. It's just especially here released the anniversary of the 20th anniversary of 9/11. It's a very timely telling of this story, and just has a lot of like, wow, humans don't always suck, kind of like feels to it. So highly recommend that if you have Apple TV Plus and are open to checking out a musical. It's a one act musical, which is a more of a rarity these days, but it's only like 90 to 100 minutes or something like that. It's basically an hour and a half, no intermission. It's just, here's the story we're going to tell. It's like 10 or 11 actors or something like that, switching between characters, playing the townspeople in Gander, but also playing like, a smattering of characters from the plain people as they're described, coming in and kind of dealing with the uncertainty of that time. And like, because they were, they get rerouted, and this is a time pre most cell phones or something like that. So they get rerouted, they land in this, town in the middle of nowhere in Canada, and nobody has cell phones, so nobody like knows what's going on in that first day, really, and they're not able to deboard the planes for a while because of security risks and stuff that are still like very real in the moment. And when they do finally like get bussed out to the shelters, they're just like, we just need to know what happened. Like, can somebody kind of tell us what happened? And they talk like there's a scene in the show. It's like, what's the last thing you heard? There was an accident in New York, and this is like 1:00 on September 12th, basically, when they're like, presenting this. And it's like, well, we're going to put you in your housing and like show you to where you're going to be staying. And then you can come back into the cafeteria. We have TVs on. You can watch the news for yourselves, because this is probably something you need to see and experience yourself. And it's just it made me think, especially as somebody who like just flew over to Disneyland last week or something like that, the idea of, if you had been flying that day and the world starts changing, how that would have impacted you. There's like a couple that gets introduced that were like, somebody was going to Dallas and somebody's going like from London or something like that. And they like meet on this plane while they're like waiting to deboard and stuff, and end up like hitting a romance off in those, 5 days that they're stranded there in Newfoundland, and end up, the guy from London basically moves to Texas to be with her, and they're, happily married all these years later and stuff like that. And so like, they're just a lot of like warm, heartfelt stories that kind of come out of this. And it's just a good feel good musical that I highly recommend to people. So wanted to give a little bit of love to Come From Away. It's going to be coming here through Gamage in Arizona here next year. I think like June of next year or something like that. So I'm like, oh, okay, now this is on my radar of shows to try and check out, to see, because I was really impressed by this. And it's just, I mean, especially, it has a very like, these are just real people kind of telling their real stories feel to it. So it's not like, here's like the beautiful ingenue and here's like the hero, and it's just like the mayor of this town and the guy who's like leading the bus strike and the one of the pilots and stuff like that. And it's just a fun, like, real feeling story to this. So, and it was, it opened my eyes to stories I hadn't heard from kind of the 9/11 experience. So shout out to Come From Away.
That's what sounds really cool about it, is because like, based on everything you said, I definitely got those like feel good vibes. But it's cool that they can not only like give more information, but also like perspective, like, on those events in those days, and then even take something that is definitely like a travesty, but make it more of like a feel good, or at least like highlight some of those things as well. Like, that sounds definitely really cool about it. You said it was a musical, right? Like,
yeah,
it's a musical.
It's a musical.
How was the actual music?
The music itself is pretty good. It's a lot of ensemble stuff, I feel like. So there aren't your typical like 11 o'clock numbers that are like, the Let It Go from Frozen or something like that. But there are a few numbers that were like really good standout numbers, but for the most part, it's telling the story, but through song. So like they talk, like one of the songs is talking about how like plane after plane after plane lands there, and they, when you factor in the flights that some of them had before everything went down, some of them some people had to be on the planes for like 28 hours, is I think one of the songs in particular. It's talking about like they were flying in from Paris or something like that, and so they got they'd already been on the flight for 10 hours or something, and then got rerouted, and then had to sit on this airstrip for hours and hours and hours before, and so there are elements that are just like talking about like the things they were doing on that plane, and like they watched every movie they had, and some of the flights basically like the captain speaks and is like, hey, here's some booze for everybody because the airlines have offered to open up our basically to give you all complimentary booze because clearly none of you were expecting this kind of experience today. So there's those kinds of stories. The probably one of the standout songs for me is a song called, I think, Me in the Sky. And one of the characters that's introduced is a female pilot who was flying one of the American Airlines flights that landed in Gander on that day. And she's based on a real person who was like the first female captain for American Airlines in the 1980s. And she kind of like gives a little bit of like her story coming up and like wanting to fly and not having the opportunity to fly because of the the restrictions in place and the gender roles in place in the industry. And she talks about like she talks in that song about like her her trajectory from going from like wanting to fly to being a pilot to now training other pilots, and kind of the journey she's made. And then the button is this like really tragic note of, and on 8:47 a.m. September 11th, this thing that I love most was turned into a bomb. And now this is a barrier between her and the sky. This like block of like, what does that mean for the future of flying and stuff like that. And she also talks about like the guy who was flying the plane that crashed into the Pentagon. She had just had drinks with him in a pub in London a week earlier or something like that. And I don't know like how much of that is like true to the moment versus like dramatic, storytelling and stuff. But like the real life feel of like this person who is this in that industry, like this historic, iconic character being part of the story is a really cool element of it. And so she has like one of the few, like, for me, standout numbers of the show, kind of telling her story and telling this. I think she was one of the few that was like nominated for the Tony or something that year, because everybody's playing like multiple parts. It's not like you're just playing this character. You're playing 4 or 5 different characters throughout. So it's hard to, in a lot of times, like be like a standout supporting person and have like a really strong number as a result of that. But yeah, there's like a fun energy to the show. And again, it's an hour and 30 minutes, hour 40 minutes or something like that. So it flies by, and it's telling you the entire story before you would need an intermission kind of traditionally or something like that. So yeah, really, really good stuff there. And then the film version ends because it is again, to be clear, it is a filmed version of a stage musical. And in particular, this is one that it was a filmed version while Broadway was closed for the last year, basically, where they brought back the original cast to tell the story for an audience of largely like first responders and medical professionals and stuff that have been on the front lines for the last year. So they were like, there's a whole like other beautiful symmetry of like telling the story 20 years after the effect, to this, other audience that is drastically changed by this. Because they when they originally released on Broadway, they invited a lot of the like based on a true story people to be in attendance and stuff. And in the kind of closing credits of the film version, they show like a whole bunch of Polaroids of like the actor standing alongside the person that actor is playing, kind of the real life people. So yeah, there's a lot of kind of just beauty and like real world, like based on a true storyness of this film, but everybody also feels just very real and genuine because it's such a like it's not a story about like heroes that like were born to be heroes. It's a story about a lot of normal people that were thrust into wild circumstances that rose to the challenge. And the film also, or the musical also touches on, while most of the, most of the story talks about the events as they happened in those in the 5 days they were in Gander in 2011 or 2001. They do touch on, like, there's basically an epilogue built into the musical that touches on how at the 10-year anniversary, a whole bunch of people who like were the plane people made their way back and had stayed in touch with the people in this town, and they had started scholarships for the people in this town, and basically are returning back and saying, hey, here's the money we've raised, and as a thank you to the support that you provided us in our darkest hours, here's how we wanted to pay back and stuff like that. So it's just overall it's a very like, this is a story about the power of like humanity, which I think is a very powerful story, especially today where we're still very split as a nation, in the US at least, of like people balancing self-interest versus like communal interest. And this is a show all about, hey, self-interest is out the window because we need to come together as a community. We need to like help people who need help. I mean, there's even like subplots in there about like this woman who works for like an animal shelter and spends most of the musical kind of continually checking in on the animals that were on the planes that day, including like some dogs and some cats and some rare chimpanzees that were like in transit to a zoo or something like that. And it's just a like, it's one of those like, oh, I wouldn't have even thought about the animals that were in the luggage holds or something on those planes, let alone like thinking about how crazy it would have been if you were on a plane flight from Paris to Dallas that gets rerouted to Canada for a week, basically. Like how much turmoil, and you don't have cell phones or and you don't have a way to contact the people that you need to be in touch with easily, like how drastically different the world was 20 years ago, and how much that, like, again, especially as somebody who just flew, like, what would I do if on my dinky little flight from Phoenix to Santa to Orange County or whatever, if that gets rerouted somewhere, I should probably let somebody know that, hey, it turns out I'm not in Orange County. I got rerouted to Vegas or to Mexico because something crazy went down in the country or something like that. Like, I can do that now because I had the cell phone, but going back 20 years where cell phones were significantly less, apparent and prominent, like they have a lot of kind of, focus on, while the people are still on the planes, talking about like the pilot that I mentioned earlier, kind of borrowing a phone from a passenger to call and get through to her husband. But also, if you like put yourself back in the mindset of 9/11 2001, like phone boards were jammed across the country because everybody was trying to contact somebody to see how they're doing. And so yeah, there's just a whole bunch of like putting you back in that mindset of that time period and the shoes of people who experienced extraordinary things that were tangentially related to what was actually going on in New York on those days. So yeah, shout out to Come From Away. Like I said, it is available on Apple TV Plus. I highly recommend it to anybody who has, like me, taken advantage of the PlayStation 5 offering 6 months of that service, because it is a very solid, heartwarming, just down to earth kind of beautiful musical. So shout out to Come From Away, and the wonderful little storytelling that they do there. Anything else you wanted to bring up before we wrap up here, Frank?
No, I think that was pretty much everything.
All right. Well, that is going to do it for this episode of That Nerdy Site Show. Thank you, Frank, for joining me this week. Especially, earlier on in the week, we talked about like you come on to talk about Psychonauts 2, which I was very excited about. And then we got the extra bonus of you and I both having played Artful Escape. So I love that we were able to kind of share in that experience as well. And then thank you for letting me ramble for the last hour or so on Life is Strange, True Colors, and Come From Away. But you can follow Frank at Irrelevant Jokes. Anything you want to give a shout out to there, Frank?
Yeah, I just want to give a quick shout out to our other podcast, That D Plus Show. The latest episode was you and Cam talking about the Turner and Hooch like reboot, I guess you would call it.
Yeah.
That's on Disney Plus. And like I had heard very little about this, so at least for me, it was very interesting to hear y'all's thoughts. And I had no idea that Josh from Drake and Josh was in the show.
Yeah, that was
that was interesting.
Yeah, that was like as somebody who didn't watch Drake and Josh at all because that passed my era of watching Disney Plus. Like I had seen this guy in the trailers for the Turner and Hooch show, and I was like, I have no idea who this person is, but then doing what I normally do on that D Plus show of like running in through their past credits and stuff, I was like, oh, I've heard of Josh and Drake. This guy was Josh and Drake. All right, there's his like number one credit that I can certainly pull from. So yeah, all grown up Josh from Josh and Drake playing the son of Tom Hanks in the Turner and Hooch reboot. Yeah, both Cam and I sat down with that and like our ultimate takeaway from that is like we're probably not going to be too inclined to sit down and continue watching the series, but it was an interesting enough thing, and especially if you're more in the vein of like Cam, who loves the original Turner Hooch movie, you might enjoy sitting down with this, or if you just like cop procedurals, you might enjoy it. But for me, I was like, this isn't really scratching a ton of itches for me, but definitely shout out to that episode. You can follow me at Trevor J. Starkey. I will shout out our Let's Plays. Go up every Tuesday and Thursday. Episodes, I believe, for this coming week will probably be my first hour or so of The Artful Escape, as well as me playing through my full first chapter of Life is Strange. I recorded that. It's about like 2.5 hours, 2:45 or something like that. So that's on the lengthier side of our Let's Plays, but you can go check those out coming out this week on youtube.com/thatnerdysite. I did not sit down and record the rest of my chapters of Life is Strange because just kind of wanted to enjoy those at my own pace as I went. But yeah, definitely shout out to both of those games that I imagine will continue coming up later this year in our Game of the Year conversations and stuff like that. You can follow all of us over at That Nerdy Site or go to thatnerdysite.com for all the latest content from us. Once again, if you liked what you heard, please rate, review, like, subscribe, share the podcast with your friends, or even consider supporting us on Patreon at patreon.com/thatnerdysite. Every patron gets early access to a monthly bonus episode of this show. This month's early access episode is me and Logan sitting down and talking about our recent Summer of Star Wars series on That D Plus show, because Logan was not able to join us for kind of the finale that we had of that series. So he and I sat down and talked about his overall Star Wars rankings, and just kind of the idea of revisiting all of that Star Wars stuff over the course of a summer. So go check that out if you are a supporter at our Patreon at $1 or above, or that will go live for everybody here at the end of September, September 30th. So yeah, go check out all that stuff. Thank you again for listening. Thank you, Frank, for joining me. As always, stay nerdy and be good to each other.